Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai haere mai. Welcome to this online event for the launching of our petition on opposing cuts to corporate taxes. We've got a fairly tight schedule. We've got to be done by 9:30 or thereabouts. So while people will be arriving, we will kick off. So welcome once again. My name is Glenn Barclay. I'm Chair of Tax Justice Aotearoa, and we are behind, with Action Station, the petition. And before we get underway, I'll just kick us off with a karakia. Nuhia te pō whiri marama, te mokia te au whatu tangata, tātai ki ringa, tātai ki raro, tātai ahurau, haumi e, hui e, tāi ki e. From the confusion comes understanding, from the understanding comes unity. We are interwoven, we are interconnected, we are interwoven, we are interconnected together as one. So this morning you'll hear a few words from me about why we've commissioned this petition. And you'll also hear from Ganesh Nana, well-known economist and former head of the Productivity Commission, and Cassie Hartendorp, the energetic and wise leader of Action Station, Executive Director of Action Station. And then we'll have 15 minutes for questions. Hopefully some journalists will be here. We'll give them priority for questions. If not, then there'll be time for others on the call to ask questions. So why did we launch this petition at Tax Justice Aotearoa? Well, early in February, we heard, like most of you will have done, that Prime Minister Luxon and Finance Minister Willis were floating the idea of tax cuts and saying, yes, maybe there is room for tax reform, but not of the kind that we would like. So that immediately led us to think that we had to do something, particularly once their friends like Business New Zealand chipped in to say, yes, this is an outstanding idea and one that should be prioritised. So that indicated to us that they were organising and there would be serious consideration given to this by the government. So why are we opposed to tax cuts for corporations? Well, what we've seen already with the tax cuts to income tax that we had, that the overwhelming beneficiaries of those were the well off, while those at the bottom received a pittance, which has since been offset, more than offset by the charges user charges that have been added and the rising cost of living. And also at a time when public services are being decimated, we can't afford the loss of revenue that this would countenance, would demonstrate. I mean, for example, and we said this in our publicity, a loss of 1 percentage point from the 28% rate to 27% would see amount to about $650 million. And that's enough to fully fund the school lunch program for 2 years. And when I say fully fund, go back to the levels of funding that were applied earlier. It would also be the equivalent of 6,300 nurses. So that's a sizable chunk of money. And if you knock it back to 25% as opposed to 28%, that is a loss of $2 billion. That's more than the entire budget of Farmac. So there's a significant sums that we're talking about, and we feel that we have to oppose that. So at a time when corporates such as banks, such as supermarkets and energy companies are making record profits, now is the time we should be looking at ways they could contribute more, not less. So with that, I'd like to hand over now to Ganesh to say a few words about the economics of this. Ganesh.
Kia ora, Glenn, and kia ora tātou, and thank you for your time. I think the guts of it for me is very much about our collective allergy as a nation to taxes. And unfortunately, that translates in New Zealand to this idea that tax cuts are good. And somehow whenever somebody mentions tax cuts, we all start pricking our ears up and wondering whereabouts in the queue are we. And we need to turn that round and say quite openly, irrespective of what type they are, we've got to say quite openly and loudly and unapologetically that tax cuts are not good. It's really that simple. Tax cuts for Aotearoa New Zealand in the 21st century are very expensive. They cost us a lot. And unfortunately, they usually cost, or the people paying the price for those tax cuts are usually not those who benefit from the tax cuts. And in particular, I am incredibly concerned about the price that our future generations will pay for the tax cuts that we enjoy today. And we've done it in the past consistently. Every election time, any party that suggests it's going to cut taxes somehow gets on the front page and somehow gets a head start. We've got to turn that around and say tax cuts are bad. They are bad for Aotearoa and they are bad for the economy. Tax cuts do not buy us anything. They leave a legacy for future generations. We've had it in the past. The best example, and they're not quite taxes, but they are the same, is what's happened to our local authority rates. It is literally a tax that we pay to local government instead of central government. And people like myself, generations like myself, have enjoyed the cuts that we've had in rates over the past generations. What has that left us with? We've left us with substandard water, substandard drainage, substandard sewerage. Who's going to pay the price for that is our future generations. And I haven't even started talking about climate mitigation and climate adaptation. All of those things will not be delivered by the market. They will not be delivered by you and me. They have to be delivered collectively by our community, by our country, which means we have to fund it collectively, which is funded through taxes. In particular, what we've got to recognise is that the demand for those services, that whether it be community or collectively through taxes, will be increasing over coming years. That demand for services, not just health, not just education, but more generally, and I've mentioned climate resilience, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, that resilience for future in terms of the economy. We've got a world that is no longer playing by any rules that anybody has ever written. We don't know what the rules are. We have to think about what we need to invest for us for the future. That requires collective effort. It won't be delivered by you and me individually. It won't be delivered by corporates. And I think the last point that I'd really like to make is, why does Aotearoa always want to play this race to the bottom game? Why are we always competing on price? Why are we trying to bribe people and companies to come here? If we're getting people to come here because we're paying them, they're probably coming for the wrong reasons. They're not coming for our reasons. They're not coming to serve us. They're not coming to deliver us good jobs and a good future. They're coming for their reasons. Their reasons. We're going to bribe them. They're going to come here. They're going to extract what they can out of us, and then they're going to go away and leave us with a bill to pay. Why do we always, and we've done it in the past, try and bribe not just companies and corporates? We're doing it latterly with our immigration policies. We're bribing people to come here. Why, if we really want people and corporations and companies to come here for the right reasons, for our reasons, I'm fully on board. That doesn't mean we bribe them. That means we play the game that hopefully we're well tuned to, and tell them why it's attractive for them to come here. We've got a strong community. We've got a set of values. We value future generations. We want to build a nation that is resilient, that it meets our bills in terms of our climate obligations, and builds a community for the future. And we won't even talk about ferries across the strait. We can talk about school lunches. We can talk about superannuation. We can talk about hospitals being built. but hospitals being built are a fat lot of use if there's no doctors and nurses that we've trained in the past to staff those hospitals. We've got a whole lot of stuff that we have to do. We have to do that together, and that means taxes. That means tax cuts are bad, and it should not even get past the starting line. I leave that with you, nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa.
Kia ora, Ganesh. Thank you for that. Cassie, over to you.
Kia ora tātou, he mihi nui kia koutou katoa. I tēnei wā, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Rau, kaua me Ngāti Tūwhare, ko Cassie Harton tō Koingoa, and I'm the Director of Action Station. We're part of a wider community of over 600,000 people across Aotearoa who ultimately have a vision for this country where everyone has what they need to thrive, and the lands and waters that we live alongside are thriving too. Seems pretty simple, right? We believe in showing up for each other and pitching in for our communities and leaving things in a better place than we found them. We listen to people like teachers, nurses, tradies, street whānau, the people looking after our children, our old people, our disabled whānau, biologists, doctors and gardeners, people who do extraordinary things for our communities despite the deliberately dwindling resources from this government and frankly vicious cuts to public programs and services. It's not a coincidence that at the same time I'm here defending the very small pool of collective resources we do have, Action Station is also supporting active campaigns to restore funding for essential services, for better healthcare, for public housing, for trains and ferries, to restore funding to the arts and for healthy food in our schools. Cutting the corporate tax will only cause that shared pool of resources to become even smaller. And it strikes us as particularly unjust that the companies that are often in the position to pitch into our society are the very places that the government is taking away that responsibility from. If I'm honest, it really feels like salt in the wound of our cost of living crisis. Instead of helping families struggling to buy the very basics at the supermarket right now, this government is saying that those same supermarkets making mega profits deserve to share even less back into our public good. Families, as Ganesh says, are dutifully carrying the weight of funding public services from their incomes. Meanwhile, the companies that are in a position to give back are being given a free or at least subsidized ride. We don't even talk about how private corporations already gain from public funds in so many ways, whether it's the roads they use to transport their goods or the water that comes out of their taps. That was funded by us. That is funded by all of us. Our public funds are not an endless, untapped resource for governments to siphon off to big business. We're concerned that lowering the corporate tax rate, as Ganesh so beautifully says, comes at the expense of our future. We can't just keep kicking the can down the road. It's a tactic to entice quick gains without thinking about that bigger picture. And again, we don't agree that we want multinational corporations who are already keen to skimp tax, refuse to offer a fair share. How do we know they're going to contribute meaningfully to Aotearoa? Are they just here for the profits? All of these questions and more are the reason why over 12,000 people have said no to corporate tax cuts. And here at Action Station, we really stand with them. We don't need a government hell-bent on giving mates rates to corporations and their shareholders while our people are struggling to get by. Instead of brokering deals to sell off our state assets, that is happening this Thursday in Auckland at the big investor conference, we need a government who will look after our public resources so they can look after us. Instead of putting the burden of our infrastructure on everyday people disproportionately, we need to make sure corporations pitch in and pay their fair share. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora, Cassie. Thank you for that. Right, at this point, we will open up for questions. And as I said at the beginning, the priority will be for journalists. We are not absolutely sure if there are any journalists on the call, but if there are any journalists there who would like to ask a question, if you could raise your digital hand. Okay, rightio. So we will then throw it open if there are any other questions people would like to ask. There is a question in the chat, I believe, so I'll just go there for a start. Right here. Perhaps this one's for you, Ganesh. I think the government business has softened on the idea of a capital gains, but are floating the idea of some sort of swap. For example, yes to capital gains while also cutting corporate taxes. What are the fiscal implications of this? Ganesh, would you be able to have a go at that one? You're on mute.
Apologies. The idea of a swap is yet again reinforcing this idea that government or that taxes are too large. Or that, and reinforcing the idea that somehow government has got lots of dollars and can give some away because it's already meeting all the demands that community are asking of it. And anybody who honestly believes that is living in a different world to myself, because the demands for government services, for public services, for collectively provided services, you can see it literally daily in front of your, on your internet feeds and newspapers and radio and everything else that goes for media. The idea that we can somehow fund government or deliver services for less than currently is ridiculous given the ever-increasing amounts of services that are required, many of it because of past lack of investment, not just in our bricks and mortar, but in our people. It's quite scary, some of the toxic stress, I think is the phrase, that is currently being experienced by many in our communities due to the functions of our economy and corporates, employing people at probably less than the minimum wage, and I don't know how they get away with it, but they do. And then pointing the finger at beneficiaries, who benefit recipients who are not trying hard enough to get a job. And we won't even talk about Marmite sandwiches. It's just ridiculous to think that we can swap things. Tax cuts, the current level of taxes are nowhere near enough to deliver the services for today, let alone for future. And if we think that corporate taxes and tax cuts are going to attract corporates to deliver those services, there's a phrase in the in economics that describes that thought. It's called trickle down. For those who believe in trickle down, again, go to the literature, go to the textbooks. I encourage you, I challenge you to find me one example where trickle down has actually worked across all of history. It hasn't. It's a con. We've got to get past this con. We've got to be clever and unapologetic. We actually need government to be serviced and resourced a lot more to deliver those services, unless we believe in trickle down.
Thanks, Ganesh. There was another question in the chat too, which is addressed specifically to you. You said that all tax cuts are bad, but does that include tax cuts that might benefit the poorest? For example, the introduction of a tax-free threshold or cutting GST.
I don't want to repeat what I just said, but all tax cuts are bad. I think I'm phrasing that in the total size of the pie that has to, this total slice of the pie that needs to go to government to deliver those services. How then that happens, whether it's capital gains tax, whether it's corporate tax, or whether it's you and me and the distribution between you and me, I would argue is a separate conversation. This particular conversation was about corporate tax cuts. I broaden that to all tax cuts. Within that, I do see, and I quite strongly see, good cases for redistributing or reallocating the tax burden across New Zealanders, in particular, I say across the generations, because there's been a considerable shift in that tax burden towards future generations. And I think that's quite important. And it's in one of the questions about GST. I do think that disproportionate, well, I do think it's clear in terms of evidence that disproportionately impacts those on lower incomes. So I think there are cases to redistribute that. Somebody mentioned a threshold for the first 15 to 20K. That's in many tax systems across the world. I haven't done the numbers, but I'm probably keen on something like that. But we go down that route and it encourages that sort of tax switch argument. And so we have a bit of a tax cut for here and not for here. And I think that diverts the argument. We've actually, from my perspective, we actually need to have an unapologetic argument that actually argues for more taxes by those who need to pay for them, who can pay for them, recognising that many of us have benefited from low taxes in the past.
Thanks, Ganesh. Look, there is another question that's popped up. Actually, this one's for you, Cassie. The petition has reached almost 13,000 supporters. How can we maximise support leading into an election year?
Kia ora. I think that's a good question. I do think that tax is going to become a bigger issue that people are going to be talking a lot about for many of the reasons that have already been said. But also we are noticing this real shift, a transfer of public wealth into private hands, and that needs more attention on it. So I think we will notice tax pick up in terms of the attention that will happen as we move closer to the election. And I think that the task is to really keep putting the pressure on. It's noticeable that I think we often think that sometimes these economic shifts feel impossible, particularly in governments like this one. But there is a real shot at actually shifting this government and to be able to move towards one that's actually more serious about the tax changes that we need to make. So I would say this is the time to really be talking to other people about it. It's the time to not just be signing petitions, but I think thinking about ways that you can actually take action within your own environment. You know, we need those letters to the editors. Hey, that's a good catchphrase. I'm going to use that again. We need all of those. We need people actively talking about it, because I think if we just treat it as a new normal, that massive multinational companies can do essentially whatever they want and the government will support them in doing it, we are essentially allowing this to continue as it goes on. So small actions, yes, and then I think watch for the bigger actions once we get closer to the election as well. Thank you for your question.
Thanks. I've got a question to Ganesh, which is, there's been the idea floated by a corporate group recently that there could be some form of targeted tax cut for companies involved in infrastructure development. A rate of 14% compared with the going rate of 28% has been suggested. Possibly this might be how the government intends to address it in the budget. But Ganesh, would you like to respond to that as an approach?
Well, it's again just another example of New Zealand pitching to the lowest common denominator. We're trying to attract, literally bribe corporates to come here to build our infrastructure. I'd be very worried about bribing anybody to do anything to my house. I want quality staff. I want quality corporates who are coming here for the right reasons. I want corporates that are going to come here and stay for a relatively long time and contribute to our community and our country, recognising their role and function is to build quality infrastructure and not just do that, but also pay their share back in terms of future public services. Again, it's just yet another race to the bottom. And my worry, quite openly, is if we engage in a race to the bottom for corporates, believe me, that most of the other parts of the world will be able to outbid us, literally. We have to put in front of corporates the attractiveness of coming here. And we've got to be unapologetic about that. We want you to come here, yes, but we want you to come here for our reasons. If you don't like our reasons, you don't share our values, then go away. We don't want you.
Look, one or two other questions have popped up in the chat, but we've only got time for one more, so I'll take one of those before we wrap up. This was the first of three questions, but we'll just take the top one, Marie. Why is our tax system seemingly so complex and complicated? Ganesh, would you like to have a crack at that one?
Because the lobby groups and the vested interest groups have been very good in pitching their case and convincing governments of the day to put in special codes or loopholes, if you call, or special rules for them, and they just continue to accumulate over time. And so the tax system gets very complicated because there are different rules for different people, for different organisations. The ones who shout the loudest, they get the best rules. Those at the bottom of the heap whose voices are never heard, let alone those voices of future generations who are not at the table, they don't get to the table to write the rules for themselves. For what might benefit them. And so that's why our tax system is so complicated, because we believe that taxes are bad. And somehow everybody is always scrambling to the front of the queue to get to the front, to write some rules to get them out of the tax picture. We've got to be there about taxes are good. There is a price to be paid for tax cuts. We're not willing to pay that price.
Kia ora, Ganesh. So thank you everyone for joining us and for signing the petition. Thank you to our speakers. What I'd like to conclude this is to read the letter that we have ready to go to Prime Minister Luxon and Nicola Willis. So it goes like this. Dear Prime Minister Luxon and Minister Willis, it is my pleasure to present to you a petition supported by nearly 13,000 people calling on you to abandon any plans to cut the corporate tax rate and instead maintain, and preferably increase, the collective pool of resources that enable us to provide things like decent public healthcare, education, and infrastructure for our communities. We and many others have seen your comments in February that you are considering cuts to the corporate tax rate as part of the budget, and this prompted us at Tax Justice Aotearoa to start this petition, asking you to say no to corporate tax cuts. Collecting so many signatures in a little over 3 weeks is a significant achievement in such a short period of time, and an indication of public concern about your plans. Cutting the amount the corporates contribute will not stimulate our economic growth, but it will reduce the resources that we need to ensure that our public services can provide us with timely and decent care and support. Reducing the corporate tax rate by just 1 percentage point would result in a loss of around 650 million in revenue, and you could do a lot with that money to make New Zealand a better place for all. Since the petition was initiated, we have seen indications that the budget might contain a special targeted rate reduction for corporates involved in infrastructure projects. Tax Justice Aotearoa would oppose such measures. The failure to build the infrastructure we need is not due to companies making too little profits on it, but from insufficient funding by successive governments, including the present one. Corporates such as banks, power companies, and supermarkets have been making record profits in recent years. We should be looking at ways in which they contribute more, not less. Naku noa nā, Glenn Barclay, Chairperson, Tax Justice Aotearoa. So I'm going to press send on that, and with that, I should say that our numbers we were holding on, hoping we would crack 13,000, but we're just short, I think. So it will be nearly 13,000 that goes in that letter. So with that, I'll just close with a karakia. Kua mutu o mātou mahi mō tēnei wā, manakitia mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whanau, ai ki te aorangi. Ka kite everyone, thank you so much for coming and so much for your support.